If I asked you to think about the United States Navy, the first thing that your mind probably jumps to is an entire horizon that is dotted with state-of-the-art, nuclear-powered ships that are capable of spanning the entire globe. Well, that might be true nowadays. However, the United States Navy at one point in time was just a mere fledgling force that had to scrape at the bottom of the barrel to assemble the technology in order to protect the shores of the United States of America, and at one point in time, this axe right here was state-of-the-art technology. We're going to go into the history and detail of the Naval Boarding Axes and how America and the fledgling United States Navy put their own little special twist on a timeless European classic. You see, when the United States Navy was first formed in October of 1775 during the American War of Independence for the sole purpose of protecting American ports and trade from imminent British blockades and predation, as well as to secure the borders of the United States, we had a very minimal amount of equipment to work with. The U.S. Navy at the time was a hodgepodge of small ships and sloops that could barely be considered a navy at all. The majority of equipment that we used was in fact British and French and European in design. If it wasn't directly bought or used from the British, well, we went ahead and copied it anyways. Boarding axes are a perfect example of this. Early American boarding axes are very hard to distinguish between their British counterparts. You can go ahead and just chalk it up to either or if it's a extant example that you dig up from the bottom of the ocean somewhere. So, hey, it's a toss-up. Now that we had a lot of British influence at the very beginning, it wasn't until the U.S. Navy was completely overhauled after a series of small attacks against American trade ships in the 1790s that the U.S. Navy started to develop its own identity. New ships were ordered, new technology was developed, they worked to find ways to do more with less, because they had to. You see, when it comes to European and British boarding axes at the time, they were all, for one, relatively similar. I mean, if you have a design that works for you, why switch it up? I mean, all your smiths are trained to make those, so, if you have something that works, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The only thing, though, when it comes to those, is they were all relatively small. The handles were generally 19 to 24 inches long. The heads were relatively small and short. The spikes were short and fat. They didn't really get over 9 inches in length. But when the Americans took those, they did what Americans tend to always do, and they just went big. And they definitely went home. Now, I just want to say before we get any further into this that this video would never have been possible at all without the research that was already done by boardingaxe.com, which I think is just the most specific niche website that there is. Now, if you thought axes was a super niche and specific hobby, boarding axes, a sub niche inside axes, is just brilliant. Anyways, I just wanted to throw out my thanks. I did a lot of research through them. A lot of the pictures that you see on here are from boardingaxe.com. I just wanted to acknowledge them. Also, if you're curious about this boarding axe that I have right here, this boarding axe was made for me by Ed over at Redbeard Knife and Tool. It's a pretty good representation of an American boarding axe. Phenomenal. If you want to see the video of me unboxing this thing for the first time, the video link is going to be right down there in that description box. Anyways, back to the video. There are three main categories of American boarding axes, and all extant examples can generally be classified into one of those three categories. They are aptly named the Type 1, the Type 2, and the Type 3 American naval boarding axes. Let's get into it and talk about all three categories. The Type 1 boarding axe was the very first regulation United States Navy boarding axe. It was produced from 1797 until 1813. Type 1 boarding axes were first ordered and produced in 1797 when the U.S. Navy requested 300 of which be made to outfit the first three frigates of the newly reformed U.S. Navy, these ships being the USS United States, the USS Constellation, and most famously, the USS Constitution. 100 Type 1 boarding axes would be outfitted for each one of these ships. The dimensions of the Type 1 were as follows. The total length of the handle was around 26 to 28 inches. The length of the head from blade to point was 11 to 12 inches, and the cutting edge was 3 inches. Now, the unusual shape of the American boarding axe can possibly be chalked up to the U.S. Navy's initial vagueness when it came to a published request for the design specifications of these initial boarding axes. They published a request that stated that the axe needed to have the ability to both cut and drag rope. And this was thought to be interpreted as something that would let you drag rope in addition to the spike on the rear of the axe. So, as a result of this interpretation, we are left with an axe that has not only a spike on the rear and a cutting edge on the front, but a pocket formed by the beard on the axe head and a series of teeth that point rearwards right behind the cutting edge. A design that is truly innovative and American. So that axe that you're now left with is not only a major departure of European designs at the time, it offers you a couple of distinct advantages that none of those other axes had. So, when it comes to the ability to drag rope, which is part of the specifications for the initial request, so because of the teeth that are facing backwards right behind the head, you are left with a mechanical advantage when it comes to actually pulling rope. So not only do you have the mechanical advantage because when you hook the teeth into the rope, you are pulling with a handle that is now perpendicular to the direction your arm is pulling, as opposed to what you would traditionally have when you hook the spike in. You are pulling on a handle that is the same plane as your arm. And if you've ever done pull-ups, you know that it is a lot easier to grab onto a bar or a handle that is perpendicular to your hand as opposed to following the length of your hand. That's just the way that our muscles work. So pulling rope was much, much easier after that. So not only could you more effectively pull rope now, but you could also hook the axe onto a piece of burning canvas or sails or anything like that, and then throw it overboard and pull all kinds of burning rigging over the edge of the ship, lest the rest of your ship burn down in the process. Now that's all fine and good, you can go ahead and pull rope and rigging and all that. However, the teeth on the back of the bit also serve as a way for the sailor to hook onto an enemy ship, whether it be a piece of rigging or the gunwales. The teeth will bite into the wood or the rigging, whatever it is, and he will be able to pull himself up onto that enemy ship and offer himself a heck of a lot more purchase after those teeth dig in, as opposed to trying to do the same thing with a wet surface and wet hands. These axes would be the mainstay of the United States Navy right up until the end of the first decade of the 1800s. Now that brings us to the Type 3. So now we're talking about the Type 3 boarding axe, and there's a reason that we're skipping over the Type 2 and going straight to the Type 3, but we'll talk about that in just a second. Now the Type 3 boarding axe is really where we start to see a dramatic improvement in both the quality, but also the technology to be able to manufacture something as small and as significant as a boarding axe, which is a pretty good representation of how America was improving both industrially and technologically at the time. The Type 3 boarding axe was produced from 1806 right up until the War of 1812 and 1813. The dimensions of the Type 3 are as follows. The handle length is 24 inches, terminating in a ball at the base of the handle. The head length is 9.1 inches from edge to point, and the blade has a 2.7 to 3 inch cutting edge. Now, though the Type 3 boarding axe is starting to resemble its European counterparts of the day, it still retains the unique American feature of having those teeth right behind the cutting edge. Not only that, the construction of the Type 3 axe was vastly different than its European counterparts at the time. The Type 3 relied on a highly precise and engineered fit of the head, the langets, and the handle. So when it comes to European axes of the time, the langets, which are the metal pieces that extend down on the side of the handle, those were forged attached to the head of the boarding axe. The Type 3, on the other hand, were completely separate pieces. The langets, the head, and the handle. It all came together in a watchwork of complex fit that was extremely difficult to manufacture. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the langets were completely separate from the head. The langets were on either side of the handle, and they also joined at the very top to form a metal cap that protected the head from seawater seeping into it and affecting the fit with the handle. The head was fitted on top of that, and it is not uncommon for Type 3s to have additional pieces of metal fitted around the head that further waterproof the head to keep seawater out. Now, as you can imagine, putting all of those pieces together with such a precise fit was extremely time consuming, and it required a high level of skilled labor and a lot of resources to actually pump those out in enough numbers to actually outfit an entire navy. It's to be said, though, that every Type 3 that's really extant and surviving out there is a beautiful, exquisite piece of art. They're axes on one hand, yeah, they're boarding axes, but the fitment is so nice. It looks like it was made just to be a piece of wall-hanging artwork. Very good. Not really the best use of resources, but they're very nice axes nonetheless. That whole issue of being very difficult to manufacture brings us to the Type 2 boarding axe. Now when it comes to the Type 2 boarding axe, it is a very similar axe to the Type 3 boarding axe, except for the fact that it is now a much simpler design that is both easier and faster to produce. This change was going to happen eventually. Like, you couldn't produce Type 3s forever. It was just going to take and waste too many resources. Now, the Type 2 axe came into fruition when the United States was on the eve of the War of 1812, and they were starting to struggle to procure enough arms and armament to really outfit the nation's militaries. So, as a result, the design was simplified, and it started to resemble European boarding axes in the fact that the langets on the side of the handle were now forged and attached to the head, which means that all you had to do was take that head and connect it to a handle, and there you go, you now have a boarding axe, as opposed to the really extremely precise fit that took skilled labor to produce with the Type 3. Now, the Type 2 basically came into fruition through pure necessity in the War of 1812, and instead of being produced at dedicated facilities like the Washington Naval Yard like the Type 3, with dedicated artisans and craftsmen whose sole focus was just producing boarding axes, the Type 2 could now be produced by a blacksmith anywhere on the East Coast and be produced and sold to the U.S. Navy and merchants and private purchasers and whoever wanted it. Now, because all the Type 2s that we have were produced by random blacksmiths all over the East Coast for both the U.S. Navy and private purchasers, no two Type 2s are the exact same. There's always a little bit of deviation, so the Type 2's dimensions are just like the Type 3's, except you're going to have a little bit of wiggle room just because no two Type 2s are the exact same. Try saying that 5 times fast. Now, the Type 2 wasn't ever a standard U.S. Navy boarding axe. Like, some of them were stamped U.S., just because they were procured for the Navy during the War of 1812. However, only the Type 1 and the Type 3 were official standard U.S. Navy boarding axes. Now, the Type 2, because it was made and produced by blacksmiths for both private purchasers at the time, that had an extremely long service life from 1806 all the way up until 1860. That is a 54-year service life, a heck of a lot longer than both the Type 1 and the Type 3. Now, all 3 types of boarding axes, whether it be 1, 2, or 3, all have surviving examples that show they were modified to some extent, whether it be the spikes were shortened or the blades were shortened just a little bit, the ends of the spikes were flattened to form a hammer of some sort. However, those modifications were not ever standard. It was all done after the fact. All the ones that were produced for the U.S. Navy and the merchant vessels and all that all came with a spike on the end. So all of this brings us to the year 1860, on the eve of the American Civil War, where the age of steam power, ironclad battleships, and longer engagements pretty much rendered the boarding axe redundant. So as a result, the U.S. Navy took their boarding axes and shortened them to the point where they started to resemble shingling hatchets of the 20th century. These shingling hatchets, or boarding axes, if you could even call them that, were stuck to the side of each gun carriage, and though they could be used for melee, they were usually used for more mundane tasks like opening up crates. However, on the very bottom of those hatchet heads, they had 2 notches cut out that were harkening back to the teeth of the boarding axes of old, serving as a little reminder of the link between the boarding axes of old and the steam axes of new, so to speak. So that has been a brief tale on the design and development of the American boarding axe and how it is unique compared to any other boarding axe in history, and how a misinterpretation of an initial design request ended up producing one of the most effective boarding axes and naval tools in all of naval history. So, thank you for sticking around and listening to me talk. Like always, I'm Lyle with the Ravenglade Axe History. Thanks for watching.